Happy Tuesday morning, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. We're going to be over in James chapter 5. We're going to read the first 12 verses together, and then we're going to just talk about some of the things that we've read. So James chapter 5, let's pick up in verse 1. He says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corroded, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasures in the last day. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of the Sabbath. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury, and you have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just. He does not resist you. Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord's at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You've heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, lest you fall into judgment." So what I want to do, I want to just point out a couple things about context here. James is going back to his favorite text, or his favorite idea here is the idea of the rich versus the poor. And think back, James chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, he says that in trials, let the poor man glory in his exaltation, let the rich man, let him glory in his humiliation, because the rich man finally realizes that he and his riches are passing. In James 1, verse 26, James teaches that pure and undefiled religion before God is to visit the poor in their troubles. James 2, verses 1 through 5, we see James teaches that we should not show partiality between the rich and the poor, but instead we ought to love all of our brethren, love all of our neighbors. In chapter 2, verse 5, he reminds them that God chose the poor to be rich in faith and to be part of the kingdom. In verses 6 and 7, he says apparently the rich had oppressed and dragged them into the court systems. In chapter 2, verses 15 to 16, James says that faith without works is like seeing your brother who's in need, having those resources, but only saying to him, "Be warm, be filled." It's not really doing anything for him. In James 4, verse 6, he says, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. In verse 13 of that chapter, we have these ignorant businessmen who are arrogantly saying they were going to go to such and such a city and make their profits and buy and sell. But he says they needed to realize it's only if the Lord wills. They forgot about the Lord. But also I want you to notice in the context, notice how this section begins. He says, "Come now, you." Do you remember where else we find that? Well, in chapter 4, verse 13, the section right before, the section about the arrogant businessmen, it's possible that both that section and this section were being written to the exact same men, these arrogant businessmen. I'm not sure if these are Christians or non-Christians, but it doesn't really matter. I think they might be Christians, and they're really wrestling with things. That's why James is writing about this. But honestly, I think what we find in this first section is why James is writing that whole parallel between the rich and the poor. He's telling the rich here to weep and howl because of the miseries that's going to come upon them because of God's judgment on them. And so why is God condemning them? Well, James gives several reasons. Let's look at a few of them. Number one, for them hoarding up their riches. When does gold and silver, when do they corrode? When do they rust? I think this picture of rust is these riches being hoarded up into a pile and they're not really being used. I think sometimes we have this idea that we can just stockpile all of our resources and God's okay with that. God doesn't approve of that, though. And think about it. What does God want for us to in using our resources? Well, James 2, verses 15 and 16, when we see our brethren in need, to help him. In chapter 1, verse 26, to help the vulnerable in their trouble and their needs. In Hebrews 13, verse 16, He says we're to do good and share. In 1 Timothy 6, verse 18, he says we're to be willing to share with others. We're to be like a pipeline of the blessings that God's given to us and our resources to others. And so we have this mentality sometimes that it's mine, I worked for it. Are those riches really ours? Well, in a sense, they are. But in another sense, they're God's resources, they're God's blessings, and we're just stewards of those things. And we, as Christians, really need to get a handle on that. But another reason why he's condemning them in verse 14 is for not paying their workers. They were not paying those who mowed the field and those who worked for them. And think about it. As an employer, you have a responsibility to your employees. You have a responsibility to pay them what is owed to them. Those workers, they need those wages to live and to eat. And so you owe that to them. Keep your word. And James will say that here at the end of it. But here's the good news. God heard the cries of those who are being mistreated, like how God heard the cries of those in Israel in the Exodus. And God was going to give them rest. He's going to give them rest here, just like he did to Israel. And so if you're suffering at the hands of someone, just know that God hears you and God's going to give you rest. Another reason why they're condemned is number 3, they're living in a luxurious lifestyle. Instead of paying their workers, they're hoarding them up for themselves. They're only thinking about themselves, not really thinking about anybody else. But notice he says they lived on earth in luxury. Many of us wrestle with that as Christians, especially those of us who live here in America, the U.S. We're really bad at doing that. We're bad at wanting more, better things. We buy something and a year later, we got to have a better thing. We're never content. We always want more. We're never satisfied. We need more. We want more. And what are they really doing, though, here? What are these rich people really doing? Well, they're fattening themselves up for the day of slaughter, for the day of judgment. Doesn't sound good to me at all. Another thing that they're doing is, he says they murdered the just. Probably not literal. I don't think the context says it is, but it could be. But it says they condemn the righteous man or the poor man. They're bullying the little and picking on the little guy to try to get themselves ahead in this life. And we can't do that. We got to be just. And so having riches is not wrong, possibly. Sometimes it is. Sometimes in order to follow Jesus, we have to go and sell all that we have and give the proceeds to the poor. Sometimes we have to be careful not to hoard them up and use them for ourselves only. We got to work on using them for others, be willing to share. Sometimes we have to learn not to be just. We have to learn not to be unjust with our riches. Sometimes we have to learn not to be so earth-focused. Man, those are all dangers of riches. Now, look at the next section in verses 7 through 11. Here's what I think. I think the previous section was written to those who are doing the oppressing, and now this section is being written to those who are being oppressed. And so they're suffering because of these rich people, and suffering's hard. That's why patience is so important. And he gives the example of the farmer. They planted the seed. They have to patiently endure the struggling. They have to wait until the rain comes, until the plants grow. And in fact, remember how James begins the whole book. In James 1, verses 1 through 4, he says that count it all joy when they go through various trials. Again, that's really hard. So how can I have that mindset? How can I be joyful when life is hard? And I think I'll never be able to do that if I don't understand what he says there in verse 3, unless I know what the trials are doing for me. And here's what they do. They test my faith. They produce patience in me. They help me hang on and keep running and endure. They produce perseverance in me, and it establishes my heart, like he says here in chapter 5. It prepares me for the coming of Jesus. He says back in chapter 1, he says, but let patience or perseverance have its perfect work. And so what is the work of perseverance in my life, of patience in my life? Well, how do you answer that? It's me, it's you. And so here's what he's saying. As soon as he says that in chapter 1, he immediately starts talking about the poor man and the rich man, how the poor man should glory in his exaltation, and how the rich man should glory in his humiliation. Now look at verse 9, kind of back to the sins of the tongue here. And he says, do not grumble against one another. Why? Because the judge is standing at the door. And he's not talking about how Jesus is coming back, literally coming soon. That's not even applied in the text. What he's saying is the judge knows what you're doing, and you don't want to be judged for it. Remember what he said back in chapter 4, verses 11 through 12. Do not speak evil of one another. There's only one judge. There's only one lawgiver. And so here he's saying you don't want to get caught by the judge. You don't want to be judged for that at the end. I think the hard part of what James is saying here is be careful what you say about people, even when you're being oppressed by them and they're mistreating you. You don't get caught in grumbling, even if you're the one suffering and being mistreated, because that's not acceptable to God. And so you don't want him to judge you for that. That's a really hard lesson. That's a really hard lesson. And so in verse 10, we need to endure. And he gives a couple of examples of people who endured while they suffered, but they were patient, like the prophets. Now, just think about some of the prophets. Jeremiah was the weeping prophet. He endured intense persecution for his prophecies, including being beaten, placed in stocks, and being thrown into a cistern. You think about Elijah. He feared for his life as Queen Jezebel made threats against it, leading him to hide in the wilderness just in despair. Ezekiel, he experienced the personal grief of his wife's death, but he was forbidden to go and mourn publicly. As a sign to Israel, Hosea was commanded to go and marry a prostitute. And then when she got herself in trouble with her lovers, he was to go and buy her back. You can imagine how hard that would be. Daniel was thrown into a den of lions for refusing not to pray to God. John the Baptist was beheaded for calling out Herod's immorality. Hebrews chapter 11 just kind of generally talks about the prophets who suffered persecutions, being stoned, being sawn in two, and wandering in extreme poverty. Man, you could only imagine, right? And then Job is another example. And you think about the sudden loss of Job. In a moment, he lost his oxen, donkey, servants, sheep, his camels. Wow. When you think it's one word and it's not. And then all 10 of his children, just in an instant, and a natural disaster happens. I think about the physical agony. Job was stricken with painful boils covering from the top of his head to the bottom of his heels. Emotional and social isolationism. His wife told him to curse God and die. His friends, they were criticizing him. He becomes despised by his community. Think about the mental anguish of Job. Job cursed the day that he was born, expressing deep despair, wishing that he was dead, that he would die. But what was the outcome of his endurance? Well, God blessed him twice as much as what he had before. God looked upon Job suffering, and he was very compassionate, and he was very merciful, and he blessed him because Job endured. He bent, but he didn't break. He struggled. He even accused God at times, but he was faithful to the end. Man, this is a really challenging section of Scripture. I hope it's helpful for you, and I don't want you to just kind of put it down and then walk away from it thinking, yeah, I got something from it. But I want you to really think about it, meditate on it, as we try to do with the Psalm studies, but really give thought to what we just read there in James. Lord willing, tomorrow we'll be back and we'll continue our reading. We'll finish out James, and I'm not sure where we're going to go next, but we'll finish out with this last section of chapter 5. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for your attention. Hope everybody has a great rest of their day. God bless you, everybody. Oh, I'm sorry. Real quick. I didn't even cover the last verse, which I tell you what, I'll just cover it in the next section. But hope everybody has a great rest of their day. God bless everybody.